Hi, and welcome to another episode of Malachi's Message, Toxic Mold Sucks podcast. I'm Elizabeth Kripe, co-founder and executive director of Malachi's Message. Co-hosting today is Emily Rochelle. She is our co-founder and she currently serves as Malachi's Message board chair. Today we have a guest who has joined us before. If you go back through our podcast interviews, you will hear an amazing interview with Dr. Peter Osborne, where he shares his story with mold and his personal journey and how it's impacted him and his family, and just how he views things a little bit differently now. So go back and check that out. Today, we are joined by him as an expert episode where he's going to talk to us a little bit about symptoms of mold, really the medical side of things, what you should and shouldn't be doing, how you can test yourself if you think that you're in mold. Dr. Peter Osborne, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Dr. Osborne, I'm just going to roll right in and ask you, can you go over the mold-related symptoms that people experience?
Yeah, I think we could break that down into kind of really two, maybe three categories, because there's mold. It's like if your house has mold, you could be allergic to mold, right? So like there are different species of mold that can grow in a home: Aspergillus, Penicillium, and then there's the famous Stachy or black mold that most people are aware of as far as the health consequences. And Fusarium molds. I mean, there are just a variety of different types of houseborne molds, and some people can be allergic to the molds. And so those kinds of symptoms might be things like chronic allergies, like non-seasonal allergies. I hear people tell me all the time, I'm allergic all year round. And it's like, you're not allergic all year round. Usually allergies are seasonal. So if you're allergic to something that's pollinating, or if you're allergic to particular, like ragweed allergy, or, like up where you guys are, I think cedar fever is a pretty common scenario, but those things are seasonal. But when you're allergic all year long, think mold. Like if you're going to an allergist and you're getting allergy shots and you just can't overcome allergies, you may be in mold. And so if you're allergic to mold and mold is in your house, you're always going to be acting and behaving as if you have allergies. And what is that? That's watery, teary, itchy eyes, sneezing, coughing, upper respiratory infections, like a frequent upper respiratory infections, trouble breathing are all really common symptoms of being in mold when you're allergic to the mold that you're in. A lot of people stop at mold allergy because they don't understand how mold can be harmful. So they just think, oh, mold allergy, it's not a big deal. It's just an allergy. Take some allergy medicine, right? Get an allergy shot. This comes into part two of symptoms, which is mycotoxicosis, which is not the same thing as mold allergy. So you can be allergic to the mold, but then mold produces a chemical toxin or a family of chemical toxins, oftentimes referred to as MyCO, mycotoxins. And these are very dangerous. They can kill you. These are not allergies like common household allergies that you're going to be able to suppress with an antihistamine or an over-the-counter allergy medicine, or even a prescriptive allergy medicine. These byproducts of mold cause immunosuppression. So they suppress your immune system. They can also damage your eyes. One of their favorite target tissues is nervous system tissue. So your eyes are an extension of your brain. It's nervous tissue. And so a lot of people lose their sight in mold. I'm not talking about going blind. I'm talking about your eyesight becomes poor the longer you're in mold. Like best way to describe it is it's like you're in water, and you try to get the water out of your eyes and clear the eyes, but it just doesn't happen. Right. And so your eyes get foggy and it's harder and harder and harder to see. And so you start losing your visual acuity. That's a symptom of mold. Now, a lot of doctors associate that symptom with aging. Oh, you're just getting old. You need to go get a new prescription. No. If your eyesight, like my eyesight, when I was in mold, I'm like a pilot. I had beautiful vision. I could read a stop sign a football field away. Like I had fantastic vision, always have. Not when I was in mold. And my eyesight still has not fully recovered after being in mold. It's gotten a lot better, but eyesight, vision problems, vision deterioration is one of those things you want to look out for. Don't just blame it on age. It's a very common symptom. Another one is memory loss. And this comes in many forms, because when we think of memory loss, we think of like dementia, Alzheimer's. It doesn't have to be that severe. if you're generally a pretty quick thinking person and have a pretty good memory, a lot of times with mold, you'll notice that your word recall starts to slow down. Like you can think of the word, but you can't get the word to your lips, that kind of symptom. Or you could walk in a room knowing before you got into that room what you wanted to do, but then you get in that room and you don't remember, why did I come in here? Like these are early warning signs of memory deterioration and of potential neurological damage that maybe mold toxins are creating. A lot of people will also have chronic injury where when I say chronic injury, I mean, they'll have pains, aches and pains that are not traumatically induced. So for example, let's say your shoulder's just aching and bothering you now, or your knee is just bothering you, but you never like injured it. You weren't like lifting weights and injured it. You weren't like exercising and damaged it. It just started hurting. So you get kind of mysterious migratory arthritic aches and pains that'll start manifesting. Mycotoxins suppress the replication of DNA and RNA. That's one of the very big problems with them. So they actually can mimic low-dose radiation poisoning, which one of the side effects of that is your body just can't heal faster than it's breaking down. Remember, part of how our bodies function normally is we have old tissue that gets broken down on purpose so that we can rebuild new tissue to take its place, right? It's like maintenance. It's like if the shingle on your roof goes bad, you pull that one off and you put a new one on, right? Well, if your skin cells are getting old, your body sloughs those old cells off so that you can build new ones to take their place. But when you have a toxic compound that's inhibiting DNA and RNA replication, it's very hard for your body to make new tissues efficiently. And so things start breaking down and you just start getting older. A lot of people just start aging in mold. They feel older, they think slower, they hurt more, they ache more. And so it's because their bodies are just basically being broken down. Never forget why God made mold. He made mold to return all things back to the earth. Mold is the great recycler. And, you know, part of how it does its magic is through mycotoxins inhibition of DNA and RNA. It's how mold suppresses all other life forms and breaks them down to return and recycle them back to the soil.
I appreciate everything you said, because I remember when we went through mold, it was my allergist. I have a severe mold allergy to the point where my throat closes, but it was him actually taking a step back after seeing countless doctors and him looking at all the pieces you just described, where every other physician had looked at each individual thing, right? My optometrist had looked at one thing, our physical therapist had looked at one thing, and he was the first one who looked at it as a holistic picture that you're describing. He said, wait, if all of this is happening at the same time, then it has to be environmental. And I remember it was like a light went off and went, oh, that makes sense. Why are we going down 50 rabbit trails? There has to be something at the baseline that's creating all of this. And I think that's so important for people to remember, because oftentimes they're seeing so many physicians and going down so many rabbit trails and not realizing there might be something that's causing all of these things to happen. And it's not 50 different routes. It might be one route. So I appreciate the fact that you put all of that in a very clear picture as a package.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to understand that, you know, the early symptoms are just basic aging, advanced aging, and the late stage symptoms are autoimmune disease.
Yeah.
And then the later stage symptoms are cancer. And I think it's important to understand that progression, because anybody listening to this who has an autoimmune diagnosis, it's like a diagnosis is not an answer. Like a lot of people don't understand that. They go to the doctor and the doctor says, oh, you have hypothyroidism, it's autoimmune, or you have autoimmune liver disease, or autoimmune skin disease, or autoimmune gut disease, or autoimmune joint disease. There are 100 forms of autoimmune disease, more than 100 forms. And so, you know, I actually, when I was in graduate school training, part of my training was in the VA hospital in the rheumatology department. So my familiarity with rheumatological autoimmune disease is extremely, extremely good in that regard. And I just remember when I worked there, it was autoimmune disease. You have autoimmune disease, here's the drug. I'm like, that doesn't make sense. Like, why do I have autoimmune disease? Like, what is triggering? What is causing it? Autoimmune disease has a reason. You know what I mean? Like, you don't just wake up one day and your body has bad genetics today, so you develop this disease. It's a progression. And in mold, it's very much progressive, because a lot of times Mold is not static. So like if you have a mold problem in your house, it may be that in summer months it's much worse depending on where you live because of weather changes and humidity changes. And so you may be fostering more mold spiration and more mycotoxic production during those months. And then you may get like a dormancy in the winter. So like maybe some of your symptoms start to improve in the winter. That's not uncommon to see it kind of fluctuate in that way. And I think it's important for people to kind of pay attention to seasonal variance in the way that they feel. But autoimmune disease is a direct reflection, or can be. It's not the only, mold is not the only cause of autoimmunity. But if somebody's got autoimmune disease, they certainly need to rule mold toxicity out as a potential reason why it's happening, because a diagnosis is not an answer. A diagnosis is a life sentence to prescription medications that suppress the immune system. And when you're in mold and you suppress your immune system, I promise you, your next step is cancer. And you don't want that, because the treatment for cancer, and look, I don't agree with the medical community on a lot of the things. I'm more of an alternative track type of doctor, but the treatment for cancers, typically chemo, radiation, surgery, and to me that's an archaic way of approaching an illness that's lifestyle induced, and mold is a lifestyle. If your house has mold in it, that's your lifestyle. You're living in mold, so it's part of your lifestyle, whether you wanted it or not. You have to recognize whether or not that's the case.
I definitely want to talk about the connection between cancer and mold in this interview, but if somebody is suspecting that they actually are being exposed to mold, how would you go about testing them to show that they are or they aren't? Like, which tests do you perform?
There's several. I think if you want to just know whether there's a possibility that you may be being exposed to toxic mold, one very simple test that can be done is a urinary mycotoxin analysis. This doesn't test you for mold allergy. It tests you for the presence of the toxins that mold produces. And it tests for the presence of those toxins in you, in the person. Now, why that test can be very helpful, because it helps us understand whether a person is being chronically exposed to high levels of mold toxins. It doesn't tell us that their exposure necessarily where it's coming from, right? So like if they work a 9-to-5 job, I mean, they could be going to work and being exposed, you know what I'm saying? Or it could be the exposure could be coming from their house. So those are, that test tells us that they're being exposed, but it doesn't tell us where they're being exposed from. I mean, unless they're like a housewife, right? And they stay home all day. Yeah, that's a pretty solid answer. But if it's somebody working and leaving the house a lot, then there may be another place that they're going that also has mold. So mycotoxins in the urine is one way. There are mold allergy tests that can be measured as well. There's predominantly 3 types of antibodies that you'd want to have measured if you were looking at mold, mold allergy. There's IgE, which is the classic mold allergy, which is watery, teary, itchy eyes, sneezing, coughing, wheezing type of symptoms. But there's also IgG and IgA allergy that can be measured for in lab. And there's also IgM. And so these are a little bit different of an antibody. There's symptoms of those types of mold allergies are going to be more what are called delayed responses. They're not going to be quite the acute. The throat's not going to close down. It's not like the hives. It's more chronic low-grade inflammation. And so those are different types of tests that can also be run to see if a person is allergic to mold. And then, as far as definitively identifying where the mold is, because once a person is being exposed, the next question logically is, well, where's the exposure coming from? And that's out of the purview of medical testing, and it's more in the purview of mold inspection, right? So a very good forensic type mold inspector would be the next step. Anytime I find somebody who has a positive mycotoxin result, I refer them to mold inspection next, so that somebody can come out and look at the home and just make sure the home is not the source of their mold exposure. And then once the mold inspector, finds yes or no, if they find mold, and then there's 2 questions next that every person should ask their mold inspector. And that is, number 1, where the mold is growing. And it may be more than one place. And so don't ever, sell short of, hey, I found a little mold over here in the bathroom, and we're going to clean that up with Clorox. And like, if the mold is growing, there's a reason why it's growing. It's usually a water issue. You guys know that. But so number 1 question to ask is, where's the mold? And remember, it could be in more than one place. Number 2 question, and in my opinion, the most important question to ask is, why is the mold growing? Because if you don't solve for the why the mold is growing, you can clean it, you can remediate it if it's remediated improperly. And I see this all the time where people pay a company to come in and remediate, and they don't do a good job. Person doesn't ever get out of mold. And so they don't ever see an improvement. And sometimes they get frustrated, and because they don't want to accept the fact that their house is so moldy that they need to get out of it, they lie to themselves, right? And they stay in the mold because it's just an overwhelming bit of information to receive. Your house is killing you. Get out of your house. Like, that's a hard message. I heard that message before. You guys have heard that message before. It's a tough one to get. And not everybody's ready for it. Not everybody can accept it. But I think if you suspect that you're in mold, those are the steps. Get a mycotoxin test done. If it's positive, get a good inspection done of your home. Learn where it is and learn why it's growing, so that if your house has a remediation capacity or possibility, that it can be done. And if it doesn't, then you can make an intelligent decision about how to get out of that environment as quickly as you can before it kills you.
So say a person has gone through this process, right? They are finding out that they have mold in their environment. What are some things that you would recommend they do and don't do from that point on? Because if you look online, which is just dangerous to do, right? If you Google what to do if you're still in mold, or what to do if you think you have mold, you get a flood of information, and it's really hard to kind of wade through. So in your professional opinion, what would be some things that you would recommend people do and don't do?
If they're in mold, get out.
Yeah.
Number one
If they're in
recommendation,
mold.
leave, get out. When I shared this with you, when we left our house, it took a few weeks and my wife's brain turned back on. I mean, get out. But if you have nowhere to go, if you have no options, maybe you just, and I've seen cases where people just didn't have an option. I mean, we all have an option. I've had people living in tents. I've had people living in mobile homes, and I've had people living in, I had one woman who drove a tractor trailer, and she lived in her cab to get out of the mold in the most immediate. The quicker you can get out of it, the quicker you're going to recover. But what you shouldn't do if you can't get out right away. So like if you're there and you can't get out right away, a couple of things that you can do. They're not a solution. And I don't want this to come across as like, hey, this is a great solution. But these are just things that you can do to improve the quality of your air and try to minimize some of the exposure, but it is still not an answer. So, but if you're in that situation where you have nowhere to go, number one, make sure you're running a really high-powered ultrafine HEPA filter. And so ultrafine HEPA will pull down to 0.2 microns in size. The mold toxins, mold spores are larger, but mold toxins are about 0.2 microns in size. So you need a filter that can pull that size out of the air to try to mitigate, again, and improve your air quality as much as you possibly can until you can get out. Number two, diffuse. I'm not promoting any one brand of essential oil, but there's a product called Thieves Oil. I think it's Young Living that produces it. There's like, I think doTERRA makes another similar product called On Guard. And then there's another company called Bulk Apothecary. They make a Formula 8, and they're all basically the same blend of different oils. These oils, an engineer from Missouri wrote a book a number of years ago where he was remediating really challenging cases. And he had, in one of his first experiences with Thieves Oil was he couldn't remediate an apartment building. He just couldn't get the air quality there where it needed to be using standard methodologies. And so his wife was an essential oil distributor, and she said, you should just try it. What do you have to lose? They're going to either have to tear down the whole building, or you can try this. Like, he was an engineer, so he's like, essential oils, whatever, right? So his attitude was really skeptical, which I get, because there was no research on it, right? There's not, like, nobody was doing this. He was really one of the first people to do it. But what the medical research and the food research shows is that many of our food preservatives, in order to prevent mold from growing on the food, what do we use? Oils. One of the most popular one is rosemary oil. Another one, a popular one, is citrus seed oils. They're fantastic preservatives because they have suppression, chemical suppression of mold. And so he said, okay, I'm going to do it. We're going to use this oil. And they did, and it worked. And then he went on to do an additional, I think it was 12 or 14 cases, big projects, not like a home, but these big projects that they did where they brought in industrial diffusers, and that was part of how they cleaned the air after remediation. Now, remember, they did remediate. So they ripped out all the mold, they pulled out all the mold. When you're in a moldy environment, you can diffuse one of these oils and it may have an impact to reduce the overall burden, but it is not going to remediate your house. So I say that just with that caveat. Don't run that oil and expect all's going to be better. Like, don't lie to yourself, but use it as an inexpensive means to maybe offer yourself up some degree of protection along with ultrafine HEPA filtration. Those things are perfectly fine and safe to do. The other thing I would recommend if you know you're in mold is get out of your house as much as you possibly can, like especially if weather permits, set you up a nice little comfortable zone on the porch, where you can spend the bulk of your day and just be out of the house as much as you can, because mold is also about dose in time exposure. The more you get over time, the worse you're going to feel and the more your health is going to deteriorate. So minimize and try to mitigate as much of your exposure as you possibly can. So those are do's that I would do if you absolutely couldn't get out and you had to kind of shift around money and your finances were tight and there was just no way that you could make it happen. If it were me, I can tell you what I would do. I would put a tent up in the backyard and that's where I would be living. And the reason some people think that that's a little aggressive, but I personally believe that living in poison is too aggressive for me. I want my brain and my body to work. And if living in a tent without electricity and without the creature comforts of modern society is what I need to do to make sure that that happens so that I can get strong, healthy of mind and body so that I can make better decisions, then that's what I'm going to do. Because what happens when people are in mold, they become disabled. And so then they lose their capacity to work, right? And I see this all the time. People that have lost their ability, they're on disability, they're in the mold. It's one of the hallmark symptoms, disease states of mold, chronic mold exposure is fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. And so these people become disabled, they're on disability, they're living in their house now, right? So now their whole life, they're being exposed every day, all day to this because they can't go to work. So they never get out of their home to ever get reprieve. You see what I'm saying? But you can pitch a tent in the backyard. Now, I know you maybe can't do that if you live in upstate New York and it's snowing and it's, below 10 degrees outside. But, I'm in Texas, so we could do that here. But get out of the house as quick as you can. Now, what you shouldn't do when you're in mold, a lot of people that are in mold will react very poorly to supplements that are aimed at upregulating or speeding up detoxification. So big no-nos if you're still in mold. Don't take glutathione, don't take N-acetylcysteine, don't take methylated B vitamins, don't start a detox program. Because what happens, mold toxins are fat soluble. That means your body, in order to protect you, if you're being bombarded by them, your body will store these mold toxins in your fat cells to get them out of your bloodstream. Because if they're circulating through your blood, what ends up happening is you're taking on damage. Remember, mold toxins create a radiation-like damage, and so your body will punch them into a fat cell to get them out of circulation to minimize the damage to you. And when you start detoxing, what you're doing is you're mobilizing those toxins out of the fat. And then you're asking the liver to start working those toxins over. The liver's job is to convert fat-soluble toxins into water-soluble toxins so we can pee them out, sweat them out, poop them out, and breathe them out. And if you're mobilizing mold toxins out of your fat cells and you're still in mold, it's going to put you on the floor. You're going to feel horrible. A lot of people that react, this actually, we could draw back to what are some of the symptoms of mold poisoning. It's people who don't react well to supplements, especially NAC and again, methylated B vitamins like methylcobalamin, which is a form of methylated B12, methylated folate is another form of methylated vitamin B9. So again, these people will take these types of vitamins and they'll feel terrible. They'll feel awful. And they're like, why am I feeling so bad when I'm taking these vitamins? They're supposed to be helping me. Because you're mobilizing toxins when you're still being exposed to toxins. Now you're getting a double dose and it's putting you on the floor. So don't do that. Like, that's the biggest no-no when you're in mold, like as to what not to do. The other thing that commonly happens is people in mold, because they're immunosuppressed, they have a tendency to develop a lot of infection. And so upper respiratory infection, urinary tract infection, GI infection, sinus infection. And the first thing most doctors want to do is prescribe an antibiotic. If you're in mold, you're being suppressed and you take an antibiotic, you're going to now create a yeast overgrowth inside your body. And remember, yeast and mold are similar, right? So mold is a multicellular microorganism. Yeast is a single cellular microorganism. They're both part of the fungi family or the mold family, but typically yeast like Candida grow on you or in you, whereas molds typically grow on other things, right? There are exceptions to that rule. Like we can get aspergillus growing in our lungs. It can be fatal. It's a type of serious problem and complication and is severely immunosuppressed. But as a general rule of thumb, if you're taking antibiotics for chronic infections caused by immunosuppression from mold, you're going to end up creating a yeast overgrowth in your sinus cavities, in your GI tract. And now that yeast is going to produce its own mycotoxins, and then you're going to be getting hit from the outside and from the inside. So it's another one that, if you're being told to take antibiotics and you're in mold, you need to think very, very hard on that and be very judicious about making that decision.
Speaking of mobilizing toxins, whenever people get out of their homes and they experience detox symptoms, do you see them go downhill first and then start to improve? Can you explain that process that you see with a lot of your patients?
Yeah, I call it angry fat. Because when we get them out, a lot of times when people are chronically inflamed, they have a hormonal shift. One of the shifts in hormones that occurs with chronic inflammation, and no matter what's causing it, in this case, mold, right? But is elevations in cortisol. Cortisol is a catabolic steroid that fights inflammation. That's why a lot of people go to their doctor and they get put on a corticosteroid. That's cortisol, right? It's an anti-inflammatory. Well, you make your own. And corticosteroids are catabolic. What that means is they break you down. They break down your cells. They break down your muscles. They break down your bones. They cause osteoporosis. They cause muscle loss. They cause immunosuppression. When you're in mold, you're making a lot of that to try to defend you from the inflammation that the mold is causing. Once you get out of the mold, you have to recover that. And that can be a journey. So some people, when they're mobilizing, now they're capable, now that the inflammation is starting to subside, their cortisol levels might start to shift in the other way. They might start to feel worse because they're still inflamed, but they're making less cortisol. They might start to feel worse because their body is mobilizing a lot of that toxin out of them. And as it's mobilizing and removing it, they're being exposed to it. And so there's this, the name of the reaction, I can't take credit for this. It's a doctor by the name of Herxheimer. Jerish Herxheimer was the doctor that first coined this term detoxification reaction. When people were basically no longer being exposed to the thing that was hurting them, but their body was mobilizing it to get it out of them. And so that can happen. And usually it's 7 to 10, as many as 14 days where that can be the case. Now, sometimes it's worse. Not everybody fits that textbook of, 7 to 14 days. There are things that we can do to support people through that process, if they are going through that process. But a lot of people, though, don't have it at all. Because they're no longer being poisoned, their body mobilizes it out. They just feel better. It's like a curtain of lead has been lifted off their shoulders, and they see light at the end of the tunnel. So it can happen, but it doesn't always. And I would just say if you're experiencing a bad one and it lasts longer than a couple of weeks, it's probably because you're not out of mold. Because a lot of people will go through remediation and then they'll get back in their home and then they'll start feeling bad again, and then it's like, they don't, that's when a lot of times they want to put their head in the sand and say, no, I remediated, it should be fixed. And then they don't want it, it's just an overwhelming piece of information to say, I just spent all this money to remediate my house and it was unsuccessful.
I remember when we got out and I didn't know anything about a Herx reaction, and I was on the floor in so much pain and literally thought that this can't be mold. I must have, cancer or something. Because I'm out. Why am I not feeling better? Why am I feeling worse? So with that said, can you kind of go into the correlation between mold and cancer?
Yeah, molds, again, they're immunosuppressive. So there's a lot of effects, really. One of the biggest effects is that they suppress the immune system by producing chemicals that alter our microbiome. And our microbiome is a big part of what regulates how our immune system reacts and responds. So it can cause, think of it as your probiotics that live in your GI tract, like your natural flora, can be destroyed by mold toxins. And so when your microbiota is diminished, your immune system is also diminished subsequently. Those bacteria that live inside of you also help you make vitamins. Many of those vitamins help your immune system function properly. So you become malnourished and you become immunosuppressed, and that's a doorway for cancer. Several nutritional deficiencies can cause cancer. 19 different kinds of cancers can be caused by vitamin D deficiency. Mold certainly can contribute to that, and that's one of the hallmark, most common nutritional deficiencies seen in mold patients is vitamin D deficiency. Then we also have the effect of mycotoxins on DNA and RNA replication. They inhibit it. So what happens is you get a cell that is being asked to do work longer than what it should do the work. It's like your gut cells, for example, they're brand new every 2 to 7 days. Your skin cells are brand new every 30 days or so. Your red blood cells are brand new every 3 months. Your white blood cells are brand new every 6 months. If those cells are asked to do work longer than their lifespan, it's like asking a 90-year-old to do the job of a 20-year-old, right? 20-year-old's obviously younger, more robust, stronger. When human cells, we get what are called dysmorphic changes. So what happens is the cell, when it becomes too old and it can no longer function, the DNA can become damaged or nicked. And so now when that cell finally does replicate, it replicates a new cell line that has a mutation in it. That's what cancer is. And so you get this hindrance of cellular replication combined with this potential for damage to the DNA. Remember I said earlier that mold toxins do radiation-like damage? That means they damage your DNA. They damage the actual structure of the DNA so that when your cells do go to replicate, that the copy of DNA is mismanaged. You ever had a copy machine? Today it's different because it's digital, but when I was growing up, we used copy machines. And you put a copy in the machine and you make a copy of it, and then the copy has like little dots, imperfections, if you will, right? And then you take the copy and make a copy of it, and it's got more dots. And the more you copy the copy, the less legible it becomes. Well, think of your DNA as this really supreme copy of instructions that your cells need to do their work. And so now imagine you're damaging that copy with mold toxins. So every time you make a new copy, it's a little bit more damaged and a little bit more damaged and a little bit more damaged. Well, that's what cancer is. It's the damaged copy. So now you have so many mutations on the DNA that the cell can't perform the way it's supposed to, and it's confused, and that's what cancer is. So that's one of the ways cancer develops. But it's been very well established that different molds and mycotoxins are carcinogens, class 1 heavy carcinogens. So we absolutely are certain that happens.
I've noticed that infectious disease doctors come in whenever they're treating cancer patients, and some of them have fungal infections that they have to treat first. Would you, in that situation, maybe tell that patient they need to think mold? Because where else would they have gotten the fungal infection? It wasn't from outside.
It could be hospital acquired too. So like what we call nosocomial infections are hospital acquired. Remember, the worst of the worst hang out in hospitals, not people, but the worst of the worst bugs, including fungus. But yeah, it could be from their house. As a matter of fact, a colleague of mine has been talking about this for probably 3 or 4 decades. There's been a floating theory that many tumors are actually, when you cut them open, are mold. Like it's actually budding mold inside of a person that's forming the tumor. There was a study recently published that confirmed that this can happen. It can happen. And I'm not saying that all tumors are mold. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's possible that a tumor could be mold. And that was confirmed. And there's another big confirmation that was made this year that was found, and I think it was with aspergillus. And don't quote me on the study because I don't remember the exact details of it, but it was a research paper that actually showed a form of mold that had made a shield around itself so that it could traverse through the bloodstream and not be recognized by the human immune system. Mold is smart. you think about what it is. It's a super smart life form. It's part of the animal kingdom, and it's in its own class. Like mold is not part of the bacteria. It's not part of, the animal kingdom per se. It's part of its own kingdom. It's part of its own class. And so you have this very intelligent life form that has adapted and survived longer than we've been here. And I think we're naive if we think that it doesn't have a way to break us down. And again, mold is everywhere. So a lot of people may be watching this are like, well, mold is everywhere. What is this guy talking about? Yeah, it is. But when you're living in it and it's concentrated in its doses, it can kill you. And that's what we're really referring to. Yeah, you go outside and there's dilution. Your mold dilutes in the air, and so it's not really that big a deal. Just like you pour poison in your swimming pool, it's diluted, and you could probably drink the water and not die, right? But you wouldn't want to drink the poison directly. And if your house is loaded with mold, that the poison concentrates in the very air you breathe. And every time you go to bed at night, you try to rest, which that's how we heal, is we sleep. It's how we grow and repair. And if your sleep is disrupted because the place that you're breathing your air is poisoned, right? How effectively are you going to heal over time? And that, aside from all the other things that it can do, mold is going to kill a person if a person stays in it in a concentrated manner. I think that is the takeaway. How it kills you, we could argue academically. No, this person died from aspergillosis in their lungs. No, this person died from cancer caused by mold. No, this person died from autoimmune disease that it was inducing fevers so much that it destroyed their health and their immune system and they died, right? No, this person died from over medication from the symptoms of mold. We could argue the academics of how the death happens, but if you're in toxic mold and you don't get out, you'll probably die from it. It's one of the very few things I've lost patients to in my career of 21 years. I mean, I had a gentleman one time, I told him get out. He wouldn't. He just didn't want to leave. And he ended up, it was like 6 months later, he died. He had aspergillosis. He got aspergillus mold started to grow in his lungs. So the mold that was growing in his house reached into his lungs, colonized and bloomed in his lungs and killed him. So, I mean, and this is what happens and you mentioned cancer patients. This is what happens is the cancer drugs, the chemotherapies, the radiation suppress the immune system too. Remember, what did I say mold acts like? It acts like radiation. Well, that's what chemo and radiation are. It suppresses the immune system and it allows for fungus, opportunistic fungus to grow and kill the patient, right? That's where a lot of the cancer patients die, is from secondary infection from the cancer treatment, not from the actual cancer itself. They die from the complications of using the medicines to suppress the immune system to overcome the cancer, and mold is one of the killers. So yeah, I would say anybody with cancer should be looking at mold, especially if you're young. If you're under 70 and you've got cancer diagnosis and and you've been eating well and exercising well and doing it all right, there's two things you need to look at. One, you need to look at mold as a potential possibility. Two, you need to look at your diet a little bit better. Eating right is a relative term in today's world. They changed the rules on food. We don't have to talk about that today, but nobody got the memo. They changed the rules on food. We have 30,000 chemicals in our food that didn't used to be there. And nobody in their right mind, if they knew that, would look at food the same way. But anyway.
Could we talk about that briefly, though? And I know nutrition, especially if you're in a healing process and if you're going through mold, is important and it is critical. And we don't have to dive into all of it, but what's some basic advice you would give people looking at that, knowing there are so many chemicals in food right now? What's some basic advice you give to people as they're on this journey?
Eat only real organic food. I mean, that would be the simplest. That requires no doctor's visits, no lab testing. Just eat real food. Don't lie to yourself. Don't, the cereal bar is not good for you. The bowl of cereal should not be your breakfast. Yeah, it's interesting. 1943, the government banned the sale of processed grain because it was responsible for about 8,000 deaths a year. And so what the cereal industry did is they created a marketing tactic, and you all grew up with it. I grew up with it too. That marketing tactic was now part of your balanced breakfast. You remember that phrase, phraseology with cereal, right? We all learned it. We all had it, literally, pun intended, ingrained into us, right? Why part of your balanced breakfast? Why the word part of? Why not a balanced breakfast? This cereal represents a balanced breakfast. No, they couldn't say that because it was illegal to say it. They had to say part of a balanced breakfast, but most people psychologically miss the part of part. And so they just hear the balance part, right? And so in their mind, the connection is, oh, balance. Okay, this must be balanced. It must be good for me. But, part of a balanced breakfast means eat sugar flakes with other things that are good for you, and you'll have balance. That's basically, but it was a marketing ploy. Kellogg's was a brilliant marketer. Kellogg's brother was a medical doctor, actually, that he was a Seventh-day Adventist who had a sanatorium that they would bring people out and they would recommend their cereal as a means to recapturing health. And anyway, his brother, the two brothers were at odds, and I think one of them went on to create the Kellogg's company, and he was just a brilliant marketer. But again, 1943, 8,000 deaths a year from processed grain products. And grain's a problem from the food perspective when you're in mold, because most grain is contaminated with mold and mycotoxins. So, this is part of one of the issues I see a lot in people who are trying to recover from mold, and they're not recovering very well, and they don't know why, but their diet is grain heavy. It's because they could be still getting exposure to mycotoxins through the food that they're eating. It could also be that they're gluten sensitive. Gluten sensitivity genetics and mold sensitivity genetics are very, very close. So like there's a couple different gene patterns that we look for mold. Some of that gene pattern for mold is the same gene pattern for gluten sensitive patients. So there's a huge crossover between the two. So when people are out of mold, and we're sure they're out of mold and they're still not recovering, you better be looking at the diet. And so a simple thing to do is only eat real food, but also look at grain, because grain is, of all the foods that are contaminated with mold or mold toxins, it's the highest. Grain, coffee, peanuts are probably the three highest. And so those are things that a person might find beneficial to cut out of their diet, or even to just get tested for. You can get genetic testing for gluten sensitivity relatively easy. Most doctors could order it. Our foundation provides testing for direct to consumers whose doctors refuse to help them. And so it's just an easy thing to do, an easy thing to look at.
Do you ever test your patients for nutritional deficiencies?
I always test my patients for nutritional deficiencies. If somebody comes to me, there are 4 categories I will test for in 100% of people 100% of the time, or I won't see them. And the reason why is 2 reasons why. One, I don't believe in piecemealing or guessing at a person's health. I think you're more equipped to guess at your own health than I am, simply because you have the advantage of being in your body and experiencing your experiences. I can't compete with that. As a doctor, I get to meet you maybe an hour, 2 hours and talk with you and read about your history, but I don't really follow you around, right? So I have to use biochemistry and technology as an advantage to helping give you a customized diet plan so that we have a better understanding of what you need to do so that we can support your body's ability to recover. Because the power to heal is inside of you, but it's only inside of you if you're not interfering with it. And so where the 4 categories that we measure, because these are the categories of interference. Number 1 is food. I said earlier, a healthy diet is relative to the person. I mean, one of my first patients out when I graduated and got out of the VA hospital in their rheumatology nightmare was a little girl with a terminal JRA, juvenile rheumatoid arthritis diagnosis. She had 6 months to live. She's 9. And, her doctor had medicated her 7 years with a cancer medicine called methotrexate. Terrible drug. That damages and destroys the gut, causes malnutrition. They had a permanent port embedded in her arm because she was in and out of the hospital so often for pain meds. And then at the end, after 7 years of just destroying her health through drugs, they said, go home and die. I mean, that's basically what they told her, right? And you can imagine being the parent. I mean, you can imagine. And so anyway, this little girl's mom brought her in. She was gluten sensitive. And she was allergic to blueberries, right? And so that's food. Like, diet is relative. This little girl is reacting to blueberries, superfood. And what a person reacts to is not going to be the same as what another person reacts to, but food could very much, even healthy food could be a trigger in your failure to recover or in your hurdle. if you will, or your plateau of recovery. So you have to measure it to get distinct around it. You can always start with just generally paying attention to how you feel when you eat. That's a good place to start at home, like keeping a food diary and just paying attention. But a lot of food reactions are what we call delayed response. A delayed response is not like an obvious, oh, I ate it and I felt bad reaction. It's a low grade level of inflammation like mycotoxins produce, right? And so you're just eating that food every day and it's just constantly causing low grades of inflammation that is overwhelming your body over time. So you can measure that, and it's something I measure in everyone. Number two, I measure their microbiome, because your microbiome is such an important part of how you digest your food, how you make vitamins. Your microbiome, there's a process called immune crosstalk. Was discovered probably 15 years ago, maybe more. And what they discovered was that the microbiome inside your gut, the bacteria that live in your gut, actually send chemical messages to the immune system. Talk to it. 70% of your immune system's in your GI tract. It's called the gastro-associated lymphoid tissue, the GALT. And so that immune system behind your gut wall and the bacteria that live in your gut, they send messages. And these messages are coded in such a way that's like, hey, this thing that's coming into the gut right now, could you do us a favor and make some antibodies to help us neutralize it? And so the immune system says, sure, I got your back. Here you go. Right. And then, so they're talking to each other about how the body's immune system should behave and should react to things that may be potentially a threat and maybe things that shouldn't be a potential threat. And that is all through the bacteria. And, we have this entire culture of germs are bad. These bacteria are so critical, right? And parents are pumping their kids full of antibiotics, and they're pumping them full of chlorinated and brominated water, which chlorine and bromine are antibiotics. They're pumping them full of food that's coated and doused in pesticide, which are also antibiotics. So you destroy your microbiome just by behaving like a normal human in our society. That's why I always call it an Alice in Wonderlandian like world that we live in, because up is down and down is up. Like what should be healthy is not. I mean, you don't establish health and protection from disease by pumping your kid full of needles, full of poisons that have adjuvants like mercury and aluminum. That's not how health is established. You put good food that's grown organically, that they're not allergic to, and that their bodies can react to and take from in a good way, right? And so again, going back to the four, because I'll get off track here if you let me, but food, the microbiome. Number three is chemical exposure. We measure for those chemical exposures. Some people are allergic to the dyes and the additives. Some people are allergic to their soaps and their shampoos, and they're allergic to their detergents or their Glade plugins or whatever it might be. And so I want to know about those things because I want them out if they're reacting to them. And then number four is their vitamin and mineral status, their nutrients. If their nutrient levels are low, the nutrients are, if you're building a house, the vitamins are like the nails and the wood and the shingles, right, for the roof. And the workers are like the minerals. If you don't have people to hold the tools and put the house together, and you don't have the equipment that is the house, you're out of business. And that's what vitamins and minerals are. And so we want to measure those. There's 40 of them that are essential that humans have to eat in order to maintain their health and function without killing themselves. And we need to measure those because those things help us understand where a person may be lacking. You're not going to detox out of mold very well if you're deficient in vitamin C or vitamin D or B vitamins. So, we want to know that because it's a simple change. We can, if we know what you shouldn't eat and then we know what you're lacking, then we can tell you to eat foods that you're not allergic to that contain the nutrients that you don't have enough of. And if we want to supplement that too, we can also supplement that. But basically, we can create a blueprint for a person to follow so that it's customized for their own uniqueness, as opposed to the one-size-fits-all approach. The one-size-fits-all approach to healthcare is, like I said earlier, it costs us $4 trillion a year, and we get nothing from it except more disease. And drug companies get richer, and doctors become more callous because they know it. It's not a secret to doctors. I have a lot of great doctor friends with great intentions, but they're trapped. They spent $500,000 to get an education, and they didn't realize it when they were going through school. But now that they're out of school, they have to see 50 people a day in their group practice that's owned by the hospital corporation. And they're having to meet numbers. They're like cops with ticket quotas, and most people don't know that. That's why a lot of times when you go to a hospital-based practice, you get tremendous pressure to do procedures that don't make sense to do, or tremendous pressure to take drugs that don't make sense to take, because they've got to hit those levels. They've got to make the overseer happy, so to speak. And it's not always about their autonomy. I know a lot of them won't come out and say that in the open, but I've had a lot of them. I have a lot of doctor friends that I talk with, and that's where we're at. That's where we're at with medicine. So, we're at a place where we spend $4 trillion to use drugs to manipulate symptoms, to give people a false sense of security about the illness that they're expressing. And we turn off their body's alarm systems by suppressing their symptoms so that they don't make any more meaningful changes so that they can improve their health. And they don't ever get better. And now it just progresses. And so then they end up with another disease and another drug, and then another disease and another drug. And it's a never ending cycle. And who does it help? Nobody. It bankrupts the taxpayers. It demoralizes the field of medicine because people are unhappy with medicine. I mean, you know anybody who's happy with their doctor treatments and their visits? You get 5 minutes with the doctor, you get maybe 15 minutes with a PA, which is not a doctor. And there's nothing wrong with PAs, nothing wrong with nurse practitioners, but the doctors are so overwhelmed that they have to hire PAs and NPs to actually see their patients, because they're churning, so many people through, and you can't ask questions and have a meaningful conversation in 2 minutes or 5 minutes. You've got to, if you want to have a meaningful engagement with somebody, you got to learn a little bit about them. I mean, we've spent more time just in this interview today and our last interview than any doctor would ever care to spend with a person, because their model is in order for them to profit and make a living, they have to see that many. Like my practice, I see 7 people a day. That's it. I won't do more because I can't give good care. I can't have a good conversation. I can't understand well enough how to give good guidance if I don't take the time to learn. And the term doctor means teacher. It's Latin. And to be a teacher, you have to be a student. You don't graduate and all of a sudden you can't learn anymore. And the greatest teacher to the doctor is the patient. We learn every day from the people if we listen, if we talk to them. But if we ignore them and we gaslight them and we only spend 2 minutes with them, what are we learning? Nothing. Because we're not taking the time to learn. We're taking the time to write a script, and hopefully they'll go away and they won't come back, because we're so overwhelmed with today's patient load and tomorrow's patient load, because so many people are sick, because so many people are doing it wrong. I mean, anyway, I'm ranting. So the system is so backwards. And, this is part of the problem in mold, is that people go through, they go through this really, really traumatic experience of losing their health and their vitality, which is bad enough. And then they're being told that they have bad genes, and nobody's even expressing maybe it's mold. And this could be a 5 or a 10-year journey of destruction of their health until they finally figure it out. Because most people don't come to me. I'm never the first doctor. Like when I'm an expert specialist. Like people come to me when they've been to Mayo in Cleveland. They come to me when they've been to 10 experts, and they're tired of a system that didn't help. And so now they find themselves in my arms, mainly because, not because I was their first choice, right? Because what I do is mostly by mainstream is laughed upon and it's called unimportant. But I would argue that it's the most important, that people have to engage with taking ownership of their own health, and they can't outsource it to a person who's only going to spend 3 minutes with them. This is the worst mistake you can make. And so if you're in mold, you'll never get an answer if you just trust the diagnosis, because the diagnosis is only an academic way to classify you so that we can label you with the right terms, so that we can justify that your insurance pays for the right drug. But what a diagnosis is not is a reason why you actually became sick in the first place. And, some experts in the mold arena estimate that probably 50% of houses have a mold issue. Now, there certainly are scales of difference between, major mold issue and a lesser mold issue. But nonetheless, that's an alarming number. And when you look at the infrastructure and the way we've gone in the construction industry with cheap builds and unskilled labor and people cutting corners, and an entire industry that's not even designed to look at how to build a house to prevent water intrusion effectively. We're only going to see this problem get worse. Mold is going to be the next pandemic. COVID was never a pandemic, in my opinion. Mold is the pandemic. And if we don't turn our attention to start identifying it better and to start recognizing the problem for what it is, we're going to see hundreds of millions of people dying a slow, horrible death. And that's sad.
I hear all the time from people that, we don't have mold, we're in a new home. And that's what they think, that just because the home is new, there can't be a mold problem. But, just like you and your family, y'all are in a newer home, what, 2.5 years old?
Yeah, it's new. New means nothing. Mold can grow in 48 hours. I mean, that doesn't take very long. Your house is 3 days old, you could have mold growing in it. And part of that is in the construction, a lot of times there's so many different parts of construction that can go wrong. And if your wood is wet and they wrapped your house, you're going to have mold. It's just a matter of time. If your wood is should have a relative humidity. I think it's below 18% is what's acceptable by construction standards, but you should request under 14%. In my opinion, I think it's 14%. You can get it as low as that when you're building your home. And anyway, we're tangenting there, but yeah, it doesn't take very long for mold to grow. And I think new houses are probably worse off than some of the older homes that have had better construction at a time where labor wasn't so cheap. We've outsourced so many things to unskilled laborers. I mean, one of the biggest tragedies in the American story is outsourcing labor to third world non-experts and trusting that they're doing just as good of a job. But we see now the infrastructure starting to fail, like the roosters coming home to roost, so to speak. And that's, we see it in construction, we see it in a lot of industries, and we really see it post-COVID. COVID is the excuse everybody's making to do a shitty job today. And that's true, especially in the construction industry. Excuse my language. Let that one go.
We have a good friend who lives in Maine, and we were talking about this the other day. They know what I do with Malachi's message. And they were saying that they were shocked that they had a storm come through. This was last year. We were talking about it. They said it was amazing because they had quite a few friends who actually had their homes tested, and they came back perfectly fine. And they said these homes have been there for decades and decades and decades, but they were built, like you said, by craftsmen. They were built by people who actually cared about their job, cared about their trade. And so they said, no, if we needed to find a home, we wouldn't buy a new one in Maine. We would go find one that had been built decades ago because they have stood up to any of the weather that's come through here. And I just think that, like you said, it's an art that's being lost very quickly in our society.
Yeah, it really is. I think the death of, well, there's a lot of reasons. I think really we could boil it down to the death of pride being one of them, the outsourcing of cheap labor, for mass production. I honestly, I think a lot of people, they want what they can't afford. And because we've entered into this is really going off tangent. We've entered into a world of credit card world, right? Where, if you can't afford it, buy it on credit, so there's no self-responsibility. And when you demand, when there's a market demand and a credit extension, people want, the companies that produce, the product want to produce more product so that they can get, they can benefit and profit more. But the style of product they're creating is not quality. And that's what happens when you scale a business model, you lose quality. The higher the number you go, the quality deteriorates. And so then there's a name for that in the business world, and it's where they build products to fail on purpose, right? So that they can sell more products. And I think the home industry has really gone that way. And they've ousted a lot of the tradesmen and the skills and the craftsmen. And I think also the technology has made people lazier. So you've got, people can sit behind a desk now and they don't have to go sweat their tails off or work their tails off all day to make a living. And, that what that's done is it's created a less diverse workforce here in the US, where we outsource a lot of that trade for, it's lower quality and lower skillsmanship, but we make more and produce more. And so again, we create products, especially homes, that are designed to fail and designed to kill you. And that's sad, because most people's number one investment financially is their house. I mean, that's a big investment. The average house today, a couple $100,000 easy. In today's market, maybe probably even more, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000, now that inflation, hit us pretty hard with this new market piece. But that's a lot of money to invest in a home that then is going to turn around and kill you. And then you find yourself eyeballs in debt on a loan with 7% interest rate, and you're out of recourse because you can't sue the builder because the house was 10 years old and there is no recourse, but now it's killing you. And so, but all your money's tied up in it. Right. And so what do you do? And that's where a lot of people are. And, that's not a judgment on my part, as much as it's just a statement of the reality of the situation. And that's what makes people in mold struggle so hard, is the financial aspect of it. You have to be willing to do radical things to overcome it. And I don't think anything humbles a person more than being in mold, realizing that stuff doesn't matter. It really doesn't. At the end of the day, the stuff doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is your health. And and if your attitude is such, then it's a lot easier to walk away. That if you're married to your materials, it's a lot harder to walk away. And it's a trade-off. You could trade the materials for your health, or you could trade your health for your materials. But if you're chronically ill and you don't know why, and you haven't had mold investigated, you absolutely should have it investigated. If you have an autoimmune disease, if you have cancer, you should have it investigated. If you've had rapid deterioration in your eyesight, if you've got chronic aches and pains that were not traumatically induced, you should have this investigated. Get real. Don't give yourself the little white lie for 10 years. Don't tell yourself there's nothing wrong, I'm just getting older, and do that for 10 or 15 years until you've allowed it to creep in and damage you to such a great degree that it's ruined your ability to function in the world and be a happy person.
Osborne, where can people go to find you? Where are you located? How can they contact you if they want to come see you?
drpeterosborne.com, drpeterosborne.com. If they want to learn more about what we do, and they can set up a free kind of discovery call with one of my team members and learn more about, what we do and whether or not it's a good fit for them and could help them. But that drpeterosborne.com. We're in Sugar Land, Texas, but we do mobile, we do Zoom consultation. So, if you're listening to this from somewhere outside of Sugar Land, you're more than welcome still to call.